There are families living on the Mongolian steppe who heat their homes through winters that regularly drop to -40 degrees Celsius, using nothing but felt, dried dung, and a single central stove no larger than a kitchen trash can. No insulation foam, no double-pane glass, no programmable thermostat, and they are not cold. If people with access to the full catalog of modern heating technology are still running up energy bills that feel unmanageable, it is worth asking seriously what those families figured out that most people in heated houses have not. The answer is not one thing. It is a system, an interlocking set of principles about heat, moisture, airflow, and human behavior that Mongolian nomadic households refined over centuries of living in one of the harshest climates on Earth. The techniques that follow come from that system. None of them require purchasing anything expensive. Several require nothing at all except knowing what to do differently. What they share is a specific kind of intelligence, the kind that emerges when survival depends on getting warmth right. The first technique is what you might call directional sleeping. In a traditional yurt, the arrangement of sleeping positions relative to the stove and the door is not random. The stove sits at the center of the structure, and the sleeping areas are arranged so that the body occupies the warmest band of air in the room, roughly 18 to 30 inches above floor level. Cold air sinks, and in any room with a central heat source, the warmest stable layer hovers just above floor height but below the rising convection current near the ceiling. In a yurt, low sleeping platforms are placed precisely in that thermal band. In a modern home, this translates to something immediately actionable. Sleeping on a mattress on the floor or a low platform, rather than a raised bed, puts your body into the warmest consistent air layer in the room, and it can meaningfully reduce how cold you feel overnight without changing the thermostat at all. Mongolian herding families on the steppe sleep this way not by preference but because the physics of their living space demands it, and the result is that every person in the household sleeps warm even when the fire dies low in the early morning hours. The second technique is layered interior lining. The yurt is constructed with an outer canvas layer, a thick felt layer, and in extreme cold, an additional inner felt layer that is hung on the interior walls. This is not simply insulation, it is a moisture management system. Felt is made from compressed wool fibers that trap air and absorb moisture simultaneously. In extreme cold, moisture from breath and bodies can freeze against interior walls, which creates a cycle of dampness and cold that defeats even substantial insulation. The inner felt layer absorbs that moisture before it can condense on the structural surface, keeps the air inside drier, and dry air holds heat far more effectively than humid air. In a modern home, hanging heavy wool blankets or thick fabric against the coldest exterior wall of a bedroom, particularly one that faces north or prevailing wind, performs the same function. The fabric does not need to seal the wall. It simply needs to create a dead air gap between the wall surface and the room's main air volume. A gap of 2 to 4 inches is sufficient to reduce heat loss through that wall by a measurable amount. The third technique is thermal mass positioning. Inside a traditional yurt, heavy objects, water containers, storage chests, packed goods, are arranged around the perimeter near the base of the walls. This is not storage logic, it is thermal logic. Dense objects absorb heat slowly during the warmer parts of the day and release it slowly as temperatures drop overnight. By placing mass objects around the perimeter of the living space, Mongolian households created a ring of slow-release heat storage that buffered the interior against rapid temperature drops when the central fire was allowed to die down. In a modern room, filling large containers with water and placing them near heat sources during the day accomplishes the same thing. Water has one of the highest heat capacities of any common substance, meaning it stores more heat per degree than almost anything else. A few large water jugs placed near a radiator or sunny window during the day and moved to the center of the room at night can measurably slow overnight temperature drop. The fourth technique is door orientation and wind blocking. Every yurt is placed with its door facing south, away from the prevailing northern winds of the steppe. This is not tradition for tradition's sake. It is aerodynamics. Cold infiltration through doors and gaps is one of the largest sources of heat loss in any structure. By orienting the entry away from the wind, nomadic households reduced the pressure differential that drives cold air through gaps, and they added a short outer vestibule, a secondary fabric barrier just outside the door, that created a buffer zone so that the door never opened directly into the main living space. In a modern home, hanging a heavy curtain on the inside of exterior doors creates the same buffer effect. The curtain does not need to be elaborate. It needs to cover the full door frame and hang to the floor. That dead air space between the curtain and the door can cut infiltration cold loss by a significant margin on windy nights. The fifth technique is stove timing rather than stove intensity. Mongolian herders do not keep their stoves burning at a constant low level throughout the day. They burn hot and fast at specific intervals, typically in the early morning before activity begins and again in the evening before sleep, and allow the stove to die between those peaks. This counterintuitive pattern is more efficient than a continuous low burn for two reasons. First, a hot, fast burn in a properly sized stove creates a strong thermal updraft that pulls combustion gases out cleanly, extracting more energy from the fuel and reducing waste. Second, it charges the thermal mass of the structure, the floor, the heavy objects, the felt walls, to a higher temperature, which then radiates heat slowly over the next several hours. A continuous low burn never raises the thermal mass of the room to a high enough temperature to generate that sustained radiant effect. In a modern home, this principle translates to running a wood stove, pellet stove, or even electric space heater at higher intensity for a shorter period and relying on stored heat to bridge the gaps, rather than keeping it on low continuously. The sixth technique is the body heat co-sleeping principle. In traditional Mongolian households, the family sleeps close together on shared platforms rather than in separated individual beds. This is partly cultural, but the thermal logic is straightforward. A resting adult human body generates approximately 80 watts of heat. Two people sharing a sleeping space generate a combined heat output equivalent to a small electric heating element, and that heat is largely retained within their shared bedding system. The felt and hide blankets used in a yurt function as an insulating envelope around that combined heat source, creating a microclimate inside the bedding that stays significantly warmer than the room temperature. Using thicker, heavier blankets that trap a larger volume of air, and keeping that blanket volume as compact as possible rather than sprawled across a large bed, replicates the efficiency of this system without requiring anyone to share a sleeping space. The seventh technique is smoked felt preparation for wind resistance. The outermost layer of felt used in a yurt is often lightly smoked during its preparation, a process that has a specific functional consequence. The smoke deposits a thin layer of carbon and resin compounds into the outer fiber surface that stiffens the felt, reduces its air permeability, and makes it partially water resistant. This means that wind blowing across the outer surface cannot drive air directly through the material, and moisture from precipitation does not saturate the insulating inner layers. In a practical household application, hanging smoke-cured or densely woven wool fabric rather than open-weave textiles on cold-facing walls or over drafty gaps takes advantage of the same principle. Denser surface fibers block wind-driven air infiltration that lighter materials allow through. The eighth technique is cooking as active heating. In a yurt, cooking is always timed to coincide with the period when the household needs heat most, early morning and evening. This is obvious when stated directly, but is almost entirely absent from modern energy thinking. A stove running for 45 minutes to prepare a meal generates as much heat as a space heater running for the same period, and that heat goes directly into the living space at the moment it is needed most. Modern kitchens are often separated from living spaces, and cooking is treated as functionally distinct from heating. In a smaller home or apartment, cooking in the morning before leaving and in the evening before the coldest overnight hours means that the heat generated by cooking is doing double duty. Mongolian herding families on the steppe never separated these two functions. The meal and the warmth were the same event. The ninth technique is the wind shadow camp position. When Mongolian nomadic families selected a location for their yurt, one of the primary criteria was the presence of a natural wind shadow. A hill, a ridge, a dense stand of brush, or even a cluster of other yurts placed upwind. The wind shadow effect is not about blocking wind entirely. It is about reducing the wind speed that reaches the structure's surface, because heat loss from a building increases sharply as wind speed rises. A structure experiencing 30 km/h winds loses heat at a rate dramatically higher than the same structure in still air, even at identical temperatures. In a fixed home, this principle applies to strategic planting of dense shrubs or stacking of stored materials, firewood, hay bales, anything dense, on the windward side of the house. A 6-foot barrier of stacked material placed 4 to 8 feet from the wall on the windward side can reduce wind-driven heat loss through that wall by a measurable proportion. Take stock of what has been covered. 9 techniques that between them address airflow, moisture, sleeping position, stove timing, thermal mass, wind exposure, textile density, and the thermal value of cooking. Technique 10 is the one that most completely captures what all of these share. The 10th technique is what Mongolian nomadic culture understood as the closed envelope principle. The idea that heat management is not primarily about generating more heat, but about reducing the volume of space that heat must maintain. A yurt at full living capacity is a surprisingly small space for the number of people and animals it sometimes shelters. This is not a failure of ambition, it is deliberate. The ratio of interior volume to the number of heat-generating bodies inside determines how quickly and how cheaply that space warms. Every additional cubic meter of air that needs to be heated is a tax on the fuel supply. Mongolian households in the deepest winter reduce that volume by closing off parts of the yurt, keeping doorways curtained even between interior spaces, and in the hardest conditions, bringing small animals, lambs, young goats, inside the living space where their body heat contributed to the thermal budget. The animals were not guests. They were heat sources. This principle is the lens through which all the other techniques make sense. Every one of them is fundamentally about reducing waste, reducing the heat that escapes through walls, through moisture, through gaps, through unoccupied volume, through inefficient combustion, through exposed sleeping positions. The modern instinct when cold is to generate more heat. The Mongolian instinct was to reduce the surface area through which heat could escape. These are not the same strategy, and the first one is dramatically more expensive. In a modern home, the closed envelope principle means identifying the smallest space in which your household actually spends its time and concentrating your heating there. If you live in a 4-room house and actually occupy 2 rooms, you are paying to heat space that returns no warmth to your body. Close the doors, hang curtains across hallways, use the spaces you use, and treat the rest as a buffer zone rather than a living space that requires maintenance heating. Mongolian nomads on the steppe did not heat the space between their yurt and the next one. They heated exactly the volume their bodies occupied, and they were warm. The thing worth understanding about all of this, the sleeping position, the felt layers, the stove timing, the thermal mass, the wind shadow, the closed envelope, is that none of it is primitive. It is optimized. Centuries of living through extreme cold without the option of simply burning more fuel produced a body of knowledge about heat management that is, in many respects, more sophisticated than the modern approach of solving every thermal problem by increasing energy input. The sophistication is just applied to a different problem, not how to generate more heat, but how to need less of it. Start tonight. Before you go to sleep, close every interior door that separates your sleeping space from a room you are not using. Hang anything heavy, a blanket, a coat, a thick curtain, over the coldest wall of your bedroom. Lower your sleeping surface if you can, or pull your bedding close to the floor. Do those 3 things and notice what the night feels like. The warmest people on the coldest steppe did not have better fuel. They had better knowledge. That knowledge still works.